Christian theological issues. And in this session, I want us to start one of the most important topics of our series, and that's the doctrine of God. That's the heart of all theistic beliefs. That's what it all boils down to. And we want to talk about the Islamic view of God briefly, and then how Islam challenges the Christian view of God, and then how do we make sense of our faith, of our belief, to the Muslims who are asking us about our belief in God. The first thing I wanted to say about the Islamic position on God, and first of all, in this series, obviously, we cannot go into a great detail of Islamic theology per se, but I just wanted to highlight some of the most important aspects of Islamic theology. The most important emphasis of Islam is not only the fact of God's existence, but the absolute oneness of God. The Quran is filled with verses that describe to us how there are signs of God everywhere in the creation. That, in fact, Quran has a very rich natural theology. If you know anything about the traditional accounts of the history of Islam, Prophet Muhammad brought his message in the context of the pagan Arabia of 7th century. Of course, modern Western historians are raising a lot of doubts about the accuracy of those traditions, but here we are working with the traditional Islamic history. In traditional Islamic historical accounts, Prophet Muhammad brings this message into the context of pagan Arabia, an idol-worshipping community. And Muhammad's message is to call people to the belief in one God. Not many gods, not gods with sons and daughters, but one absolute God. And it's the fact that there is only one God, that we need to worship one God, we need to submit to that God, His will, His commands, His path. And so that's the heart of the Islamic view of God in the Quran. Just this constant repetition of the absolute oneness of God. And not only that, but there is also in the Quran, there are passages that talk about the beautiful names of God, trying to describe God with various words and descriptions. One such passage is Surah, a number of those passages, but one such passage I just want to read is Surah 59, or chapter 59 of the Quran. And by the way, I didn't mention this in the introductory session, but I am reading from Yusuf Ali's translation, English translation of the Quran. In the West, in America, England, this is one of the most respected translations of the Quran for Muslims themselves. That's why I use it. If you're following my talks on the tape, sometimes in your Quran, some of the verses might be up and down by a couple of numbers, so do check the references, and in the Qurans, they're not always the same exact reference number. But I'm going to look at Surah 59, verses 23 and 24, the last two verses of Surah or chapter 59. God is He, than whom there is no other God, the Sovereign, the Holy One, the source of peace, the guardian of faith, the preserver of safety, the exalted in might, the irresistible, the supreme. Glory to God. High is He above the partners they attribute to Him. He is God, the creator, the evolver, the bestower of forms. To Him belong the most beautiful names. Whatever is in the heavens and on earth doth declare His praises and glory, and He is the exalted in might, the wise. So there are passages like this in the Quran that talk about the most beautiful names of God. And then in Islamic tradition and piety, Muslims have come up with the 99 most beautiful names of God. Of course, when you count all the names in various lists in Islamic history, there's more than 99 names, but usually it's called the 99 names of the most beautiful names of God. And these names are like adjectives describing who God is and what He has done. And most of these names and most of the descriptions of God in the Quran emphasize not just His oneness, not just His absolute oneness, but His absolute transcendence. God is a transcendent God. He is majestic. He is the infinite one. He is the creator. He is the transcendent God. Later on, when we talk about the doctrine of man, we will elaborate more on this. Because God is so transcendent, the only relationship that human beings can have with God is the relationship of a servant or a slave to that of a master. God is the master king, the sovereign one. And so this emphasis, this total emphasis on the oneness, the absoluteness, the transcendence, the majesty of God is prominent throughout the entire Quran. Another very key passage, we will talk more about this later on also, but Surah 112, that's a surah that Muslims repeat in their prayers, daily prayers, numerous times every day. It says, "Say he is God, the one and only, God, the eternal, the absolute. He begetteth not, nor is he begotten. He begetteth not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him." He is so different. He is so above. He is so beyond. So any kind of associating any partners with God, we read earlier in that passage, any idea that God could have sons or daughters, or we could have any such relationship with God, is absolute blasphemy and absolute nonsense from the Quranic perspective. So if this is the Quranic approach to the doctrine of God, and now we Christians, we go and tell Muslims that we can have a relationship with God, a relationship of sons and daughters to God. As Christians, a part of our good news is to say we can call God Father, and we can become a child of God through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, for us, that's great news. But for a Muslim, that's horrible news. A Muslim doesn't get excited. I mean, an Orthodox Muslim who knows his Quran and his theology, that's not an exciting piece of information. That's blasphemy, because that's what the Quran says. So the first point I want to talk about, before we actually get into the doctrine of the Trinity, I want to talk about how Islam challenges the Christian view of the fatherhood of God. That there are numerous passages in the Quran that refute that there is any such thing that we can say about God. And so I told you I want to also include practical tips on communicating the Christian faith to Muslims, not just pure theology here. And so a big part of our calling as Christians in discussing with our Muslim friends is to know their sensitivities, to know the issues, to be aware of them, and to clarify misunderstandings that exist. So if you don't know that a Muslim, for him, receiving the news that God can be our Father and we can be his sons and daughters, if you don't know that that's not good news, you can just share it and say, why didn't he respond with joy to this piece of information? Well, they didn't, because the Quran denounces any such idea. I want to read some passages to you, for example, in Surah 2, verse 116. Surah 2, verse 116, for example. We read, people say, God has begotten a son. Glory be to him. Nay, to him belongs all that is in the heavens and on earth. Everything renders worship to him. It's nonsense to say God has begotten a son. And there are some very graphic passages in the Quran that say that that's the most horrible thing a lie that one can say about God. Now, I want you to also learn how to become sensitive about the Muslim perspective. You need to understand what a Muslim hears when what a Muslim understands when he hears our terminology. Yusuf Ali, the translation that I'm using, Yusuf Ali also, one good thing about his Quran is that he not only translates the Quran, but he has extensive commentaries and footnotes at the bottom of each page of the Quran. So here he was a very educated Indian Muslim. He was very familiar with a great deal of ideas about Christianity, for example, and other world religions. So he's a scholarly man that translated the Quran. And yet, this is how he understands this verse. Listen to what Yusuf Ali, an educated Muslim, writes in the footnote of this passage of Surah 2, verse 116. He says, "It is a derogation from the glory of God. In fact, it is blasphemy to say that God begets sons like a man or an animal." Of course, that's not what we say, but that's what he's hearing. And then see what he continues to say. "The Christian doctrine is here emphatically repudiated. If words have any meaning, it would mean an attribution to God of a material nature and of the lower animal functions of sex." And so This is what Yusuf Ali understands, that when you say God can be a father and he can have a son or sons and daughters, that we are describing to God a sexual relationship, and that's blasphemy and nonsense. Now, it's funny when he says, to say that God begets sons like a man or an animal is a derogation to the glory of God. And we say, of course. And then he goes on to say, this is the repudiation of the Christian doctrine. It's no such thing. That's not what the Christian faith says at all. But that's how a Muslim thinks that what we are saying. That's how a Muslim misunderstands what the Christian faith has been saying. I want to look at another passage here in Surah 19, verse 35. Again, a very similar thing. Surah 19, verse 35. This is what we read in the Quran. It is not It is not befitting to the majesty of God that he should beget a son. It is not befitting to the majesty of God that he should beget a son. Glory be to him. When he determines a matter, he only says to it, be, and it is. God is a sovereign God. He doesn't need to have sons and daughters. He just commands and they come into existence. And once again, this is what Yusuf Ali writes in his commentary on Surah 19, verse 35. He says, begetting a son is a physical act depending on the needs of men's animal nature. God Most High is independent of all needs, and it is derogatory to him to attribute such an act to him. It is merely a relic of pagan and anthropomorphic materialist superstitions. This is pagan superstition and mythology that Christians have incorporated into their theology. No, there is no such thing that we can say about God. Notice how often a Muslim understands any talk about God's fatherhood in physical, sexual terms. And as Christians, we must be very emphatic that that's not what we mean. That's not what we believe. That's not what the Bible says. That's not what Christian theology has ever said. And this misunderstanding about God having sons or daughters, or later on when we talk about Jesus being the unique Son of God, is not just a misunderstanding based on Muslim commentators or the Muslim popular ideas. This misunderstanding is actually rooted in the Quran itself. The Quran itself greatly misunderstands Christian faith. In Surah 6, verse 101, this is what the Quran says. This is God speaking in the Quran, supposedly, as Muslims believe. To him is due the primal origin of the heavens and earth. That's Surah 6, verse 101. To him is due the primal origin of the heavens and earth. How can he have a son when he has no consort? He created all things and he has full knowledge of all things. God couldn't have a son because he doesn't have a female companion. It's nonsense to think he can have a son. How could he have a son when he has no consort? And so this deeply rooted misunderstanding in the Quran and in Islam, that to say of God that he can be a father to us, or Jesus is the Son of God, implies sexual connotation. And as Christians, again, as I said, have been saying all along, that we need to be very patient in addressing misunderstandings. And we say, no, when we talk about the fatherhood of God, when we talk about we can become the children of God, or later on when we talk about Jesus being the unique Son of God, we are not implying that God has a physical body, or God has had sex with anybody, or God through sexual relationship has produced sons and daughters. These were pagan ideas and ideas of idol worshiping communities. We're talking about a spiritual relationship we can have with God. Sons and daughters in a spiritual sense. He is a father in a spiritual sense, not in a physical, sexual sense. And it's interesting, and I think it's a sign how Islam is becoming a little bit maybe more radicalized, even in the various editions of Yusuf Ali's Quran. In Yusuf Ali's Quran, the version that I have, an earlier edition of it, in Surah 2, verse 116, I read to you the footnote he had. After Yusuf Ali had said, it would mean an attribution to God of a material nature and the lower animal functions of sex, Yusuf Ali went on to say, in a spiritual sense, we are all children of God. He had written that in his footnote. In today's editions of Yusuf Ali, that sentence is taken out. The sentence that says, in a spiritual sense, we are all children of God. Of course, that's also not the biblical idea. We are not all children of God in a spiritual sense. Through Christ, we become the children of God. But at least Yusuf Ali had tried to open a little bit of a place for understanding the Christian faith. But even in today's edition, we see that that verse has been taken out, that passage has been deleted from Yusuf Ali's commentary. So the first point, again, that Islam denies the fatherhood of God, and we need to be patient in telling Muslims that what they deny is not what we believe. That we believe that God is our creator, God is spirit, God doesn't have a physical body, God doesn't have sexual relationship with anybody or anything, but we can, in a spiritual sense, come in a relationship with God, in a relationship of intimacy, in a relationship of love, in a relationship of fellowship that resembles the relationship we can have with an earthly parent. And in that sense, we can say God is our Father, or Jesus is the unique Son of God. So that's the first point. But the much more significant issue, besides the fatherhood of God, is the doctrine of the Trinity. As I said in the introduction to this series, the doctrine of the Trinity is one of those very, very complex pieces of Christian theology. Many Christians themselves struggle with understanding it, making sense of it, explaining it to others, such as Muslims who challenge them on it. And so we want to spend a good bit of time on trying to grappling with the Christian affirmation of the triunity of God. The materials that I want to let you know right now, that much of what I will be sharing in this series, you can access from many books, many finely written, published books on the subject of Islam and Christian theology. But the materials on the Trinity are somewhat unique because they are mostly my own research that I did for one of my master's programs. And I'm trying to help folks to look at this issue from a fresh perspective, a new perspective. So it's not the typical kind of stuff you can find in materials or published materials on this subject. So I hope that you pay attention, especially to these segments, and follow me carefully. But before I get into the discussion of the Trinity and how Islam has challenged this doctrine, how do we respond and how do we explain this, how do we understand it, I want to read something to you written by Hans Kung. Hans Kung, a very famous and controversial Catholic theologian, very involved in dialogue with world religions, including Islam. He has a book called Christianity and World Religions. Christianity and World Religions. And one of the chapters is called Islam and Other Religions, Jesus in the Quran. But he points out something that I think is very important here. This is what Hans Kung says. Historians always note with surprise how little power of resistance Christianity has shown, even compared with Judaism, so much weaker numerically, in competition with Islam. Historians always note with surprise how little power of resistance Christianity has shown in competition with Islam. He's talking about the historical spread of Islam over North Africa, the Middle East. If you remember, when Islam kind of exploded on the scene in the 7th century, all around that area of the Arabian Peninsula, it was the Christian church that was the dominant presence. And yet they were kind of wiped out very quickly without a lot of resistance. That's what he's referring to. He said, aside from Islam's great military, political, and organizational strength, a major cause of this shortfall seems to have been the inadequate rationale of the central Christian dogma. And he has it italicized. The inadequate rationale of the central Christian dogma, in parenthesis, the Trinity, and along with it, the Incarnation. And then he goes on to say Catholic theologian Herman Stiglicker, who in his book The Teachings of Islam gives a fine report on the theological controversies between Christians and Muslims, rightly treats this inadequacy as one of the main reasons leading to the collapse of Christendom in the very regions where it had first sprung up, the Near East and North Africa. Now, what Hans Kung is saying is this. One of the reasons Christianity collapsed very quickly after the invasion of Islam was because most Christians didn't know how to defend their faith. Most Christians didn't know the central dogmas of their faith. It was the inadequacy of their theological rational justification. They couldn't put up a fight against Islam. He says Jews did much better, although they were much smaller than Christians numerically. But because of the weakness in their own understanding of their own theology, the Christian church collapsed very quickly in confrontation with Islam. And it's not just historically. I remember some years ago an article came out in Washington Post, a prominent newspaper in America, and it talked about how at the time, the article said there are about 50,000 Hispanics who have converted to Islam here in America. And the article focused on the story of a Hispanic woman. She was from a Central American country who was living in America. And the story was about how she had converted to Islam. And she said, I didn't know the doctrine I didn't know what we believe when we talked about the Trinity. I didn't know, the Christian faith and doctrines was so confusing to me. This lady had grown up in a Catholic church. She said, I went to my priest. I asked him what we believe about these things, like the Trinity. And the priest said, oh, you just have to accept it by faith. It's a mystery. Don't worry about it. And she said, I felt very empty. I felt like I needed intellectual, I needed justification. I needed an explanation. I needed a clarification for this. And she found out about Islam, was exposed to Islamic teachings. It seemed very rational, very easy to understand. And she eventually converted to Islam. So I am saying, why am I saying all this? Is that it's important for us to take the doctrines of our faith seriously. It is important for us to know what we believe and why we believe. I keep repeating this. I hope I can drill this into you, that we shouldn't just be attending church, kind of just experience a spiritual revival and not address and not think through with our heads what it is that we claim, what it is that we believe, and how to defend it. So that's, again, all an introduction. I hope you're patiently still with me to talk about how important it is for us to know our own theology. Now, I'm going to read portions of my thesis here. I'm going to read portions of my thesis in this discussion of the doctrine of the Trinity. And what we want to do is this. We want to talk about, first of all, the Muslim objections to the doctrine of the Trinity. So the first part of these sessions that we are doing is we want to look at historically, what have Muslims said against the doctrine of the Trinity? I have cataloged basically all the objections in the 1400 years of encounter between Islam and Christianity. I have cataloged all the Muslim objections under a number of points. So I want to first talk about how Muslims have objected, refuted, challenged the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. I want us to make brief responses to those challenges. How do we respond to these issues? And then I want to talk about a new way of looking at this doctrine, a new way of trying to grapple with it, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand its importance to all of our lives. And I think many people that have heard me lecture on this topic have found it very helpful, have found it a blessing to their own Christian faith, and I hope that you will have the same, you will agree with them. I hope that this is a blessing to you. But before I get into the Muslim objections, let me just read what I have written as an introduction here. The heart of all theistic faiths is the question of God. The reality and the nature of God are of utmost fundamental importance in the structure of any religious system. Each theistic religion finds its most basic identity in its particular view of God and of God's relationship to humanity. Islam and Christianity, being the two largest monotheistic faiths in the world, have had a long and rich exchange in their theological encounters with each other concerning the question of God. In fact, one scholar says this, the historical controversy between the two religions is centered theologically on the concept of God. This is where these two systems, bottom line, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is, I try not to use a lot of American expressions, I'm sorry, but this is basically, it comes down to this tension on the concept of God. So the historical controversy between the two religions is centered theologically on the concept of God. Norman Daniel, he wrote a classic book called Islam and the West, The Making of an Image. And this is what he writes about Christian-Muslim encounter throughout history. The Islamic denial of the Trinity seemed to be the basic point of difference between the religions. And it was general to put the denial of the Trinity at the beginning of any account of Islamic teaching. So whenever Muslims wanted to talk about Christianity, or Christians wanted to talk about what Islam taught, the doctrine of the Trinity was the very first point, the central point, the beginning point of the differences and the debates. Islam sees itself as God's final religion to humanity, with the basic message that there is no God but the one true God. According to one Muslim writer, Islam, like other religions before it, in their original clarity and purity, is nothing other than the declaration of the unity of God. And its message is a call to testify to this unity. Another Muslim writer says, the unity of Allah is the distinguishing characteristic of Islam, his absolute oneness, basically. This is the purest form of monotheism, the worship of Allah, who was neither begotten nor beget, nor had any associates with him in his Godhead. Islam teaches this in the most unequivocal terms. And then a Western professor, Vincent Cornell, puts it this way: the Islamic attitude towards the Christian view of the Trinity. To assert that there is more than one absolute, or that the relative is absolute, is both the height of folly and the source of disbelief. This awareness of the unitary truth of God was deemed so important as to constitute the essence of knowledge itself. In kind of a plainer, simpler English, basically Vincent Cornell is saying that the absolute oneness of God was the essence of faith and knowledge and rationality for Muslims. And the belief that God could be not this absolutely one being in essence and persons and all that was absolutely folly and folly and disbelief to think that God is anything but absolutely one. So we can see that the doctrine of the Trinity, not only historically but to this very day, is the gulf that separates Islam and Christianity. And again, people in this day and age who say, oh, we all believe the same thing about God, we all believe there is one God, they really haven't paid attention in any honest way to what these two scriptures, the Bible and the Quran, say about God and who he is, what he has done, how we can have a relationship with him. So in these sessions, we want to talk about these issues. Now, my objections, if you're kind of writing down this outline, let me find my little outline here. I have divided or categorized the Islamic objections to the doctrine of the Trinity under 5 points. So I'm going to mention it right now, and then I will repeat it as we go through. The Islamic objections against the Trinity, first of all, there are the Quranic objections. So objections based in the Quran itself, the text of the Quran. So there are Quranic objections to the doctrine of the Trinity. Then there are objections concerning the logical coherence of the Trinity. Thirdly, objections concerning the titles of the Trinity. Number 4, objections concerning the introduction of composition and plurality into God. And number 5, historical objections. So let me repeat it one more time very quickly. Objections based on the Quran, Quranic objections. Objections concerning the logical coherence of the Trinity. Objections concerning the titles of the Trinity. Objections concerning the introduction of composition and plurality into God. And then there are the historical objections. And so we will elaborate every one of these things for you as we start down the path of this discussion. Objections arising out of the Quran. The Muslim rejection of the Christian view of God finds its foundation in the Quran. In addition to numerous passages proclaiming the oneness of God, and other verses that refute the Christian ascription of deity to Christ, we will talk about that more, there are also 2 seemingly more explicit Quranic passages that speak out directly against the Trinity. In Surah 4, verse 171, we read, "So believe in God and his apostles. Say not Trinity, desist. It will be better for you, for God is one God." And later in Surah 5, verse 76, we see the following warning. "They do blaspheme who say God is one of 3 in a Trinity. For there is no God except one God. If they desist not from their word of blasphemy, verily a grievous penalty will befall the blasphemers among them." So 2 passages that explicitly seem to condemn this Christian doctrine. Now, there have been Muslim scholars there have been scholars of Islam, mostly Western scholars, that have said that what the Quran denies is not Orthodox Christian doctrine of the Trinity, but misunderstandings of the Trinity or tritheism, or different conceptions of the Trinity that are not Christian conceptions of that doctrine. So that's a very popular argument, and I actually accept that also. I believe that that's the case, that the Quran is not very clear on Christian theology and Christian teachings. And so that's a very common thing, analysis that we read by Western scholars, especially of Islam. For example, Wolfson, representative of many of the Western scholars of Islam, writes this: "The Christian doctrine of the Trinity and the Incarnation, as represented in the Quran, do not agree with these doctrines as formulated by the Christian councils, by the church councils. With regard to the Christian Trinity, as represented in the Quran, it consisted of God, Jesus, and Mary. No adequate explanation of the Quranic representation of Christian Trinity has been advanced." Now, you hear this a lot, that the doctrine of the Trinity in the Quran is God, Mary, and Jesus. The Quran itself doesn't explicitly say that anywhere. I want you to know that. That's just a interpretation that we have about the Quran, and this idea is based on Surah 5. I want you to, if you can follow me or have a Quran, look at it. Surah 5, verse 119. It's a description of the Day of Judgment. And God is asking Jesus questions. And this is what it says. "And behold, God will say on the Day of Judgment, God will say, O Jesus, the Son of Mary, didst thou say unto men, worship me and my mother as gods in derogation of God? He will say," Jesus will say to God, "Glory to thee. Never could I say what I had no right to say. Had I said such a thing, thou wouldst indeed have known it. Thou knowest what is in my heart, though I know not what is in thine, for thou knowest in full all that is hidden." And the passage goes on to say, "I never said such a thing. I just told people to worship you." But the question that supposedly God asks Jesus here, "Didst thou say unto men, worship me and my mother as derogation of God?" It seems that based on this passage, Western commentators and scholars have said the Quran is so confused about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity that the Trinity for the Quran is God possibly having sexual relationship with Mary and then producing Jesus as the Son. Now, Muslim scholars respond to this saying, no, there is no confusion in the Quran. One Muslim scholar, famous Egyptian writer, Haykal, sees this critique as utterly groundless, this view that this is what the Quranic view of the Trinity is. Haykal goes on to say, the Quran certainly criticized and condemned Trinitarianism. The Quranic position is simply that whoever and whatever the persons of the Trinity may be, Trinitarianism is a blasphemous compromise of divine transcendence and unity. So Muslims say whether there were some Christian sects in Arabia that the Quran was criticizing, whether it's another Christian theology that we don't know about today, regardless of whether it's Orthodox Christianity or an aberration of Christian teaching, the Quran denounces anything but the absolute monotheistic view of God. And I agree with that also, with that's what the Quranic position is. Haykal goes on to say that the apparent unorthodox formulations of the Trinity in the Quran need not be a mistake. Indeed, it is quite probable that some Near Eastern Christians had held such a view, as I said just now, since in this, as well as in many other passages, the Quran is simply reporting what is being heard. And so, no, the Quran doesn't make a mistake. It's the Word of God. It cannot make a mistake, but these were just views common at the time that the Quran is criticizing and rejecting. And there are other scholars who do not say the doctrine of the Trinity in the Quran is God, Mary, and Jesus, but they still say that the Quran only is denouncing tritheism, the belief in three gods, not the Christian view of the Trinity. One of these scholars is William Montgomery Watt, very famous Islamic scholar of Islam at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And this is what William Montgomery Watt writes. It is commonly thought that the Quran criticizes the doctrine of the Trinity, but this is not necessarily so. One of the verses dealing with the point is Surah 5, verse 73. Taken literally, this verse is criticizing belief in three gods, not in three hypostases. That's a technical term, we'll talk about it later. And from a Christian point of view, belief in three gods is a heresy, tritheism. Throughout the centuries, there have probably been simple-minded and badly instructed Christians whose effective belief may in fact have been tritheism, and there may well have been some such people in Arabia in Muhammad's time. Insofar as this is so and the Quran is attacking tritheism, it is attacking a Christian heresy, and Orthodox Christians would agree with its criticism. Now, what Watt is trying to do is to say, listen, the Quran is not in disagreement with Christian faith. The Quran is denouncing heresies that also as Christians we can denounce. I can agree with Watt on a literal basis when the Quran, for example, in Surah 576, what do we read? It says, they do blaspheme who say God is one of three in a Trinity. That's not what the Christian faith says. God is one of Trinity. But I believe that, as Islamic scholars point out, that the Quran still, regardless of whether the Quran is addressing Orthodox Trinity or heretical understandings of God in Christian circles, the Quran leaves no room for anything like the Christian view of God. Because the Quran says there is only God, and as we read earlier in Surah 112, say He is God, the one, only God, the eternal, the absolute, He begetteth not, directly addressing Christian theology, nor is He begotten, and there is no one like unto Him. In fact, this Surah 112 that I said Muslims repeat in their verses numerous times every day, is so important for Muslims that there's a famous tradition of Prophet Muhammad related by Al-Bukhari, one of the most important, significant Sunni scholars of hadith literature, reporting the traditional sayings of Muhammad. According to Bukhari's report of Muhammad saying, this surah, this one surah, short one, Surah 112, is worth 1/3 of the Quran. And to confess this verse is to shed one's sins as a man might strip a tree in autumn of its leaves. That just tells you in Islam the central significance of Surah 112, that God doesn't beget, is not begotten, only one absolute, no one like unto Him. And it's very clear how this verse is trying to refute the Christian view of the sonship of Christ and the Christian view of the Trinity. However, what I also want to say The second argument of the Quran. So one Quranic objection to the Trinity is don't do it, desist from it, it's blasphemy, it's not true. The Quran has a second argument against the Trinity. The Quran argues that divine plurality leads to chaos, not cosmos. If there is more than one God, then there will be conflict. If there is more than one absolute, there will be conflict between the two absolutes or the three absolutes. It will not result in cosmos, in harmony, in a universe. It will result in chaos. In fact, later on in Islamic history, this argument, this particular Quranic argument, became one of the most popular Islamic objections against the Trinity among Muslim theologians. In Surah 21, verse 22, this is what we read in the Quran. If there were in the heavens and the earth other gods besides God, there would have been confusion in both. But glory to God, the Lord of the throne. High is he above what they attribute to him. And so this is the verse that says, if there is more than one God, there will be confusion, there will be chaos, not cosmos, and denouncing the idea that there could be more than one absolute. Later on, Muslim theologians, for example, Abdul Jabbar, who was a Mu'tazilite theologian in the 11th century, based on this Quranic text, he develops a logical proof that God is one and has no second. Abdul Jabbar says, if there were two beings who were omnipotent in themselves, it would be possible for one of them to cause a body to move and the other to cause it to remain at rest. If that were the case, it would have been so in one of three ways. And then I'm not going to go into the details. It kind of becomes pretty abstract philosophy. But basically, if there is more than one absolute will, there will be conflict. And there will be differences between them, even in moving a body. And so it's absolutely absurd and impossible that there can be more than one absolute will. And then Abdul Jabbar, after working out this logical syllogism, he says, on this basis, the doctrine of Christians that in God are three hypostases is refuted. So Abdul Jabbar uses this argument that there cannot be more than one absolute will to refute the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. And then another Muslim theologian, Al-Ash'ari, a very key Muslim theologian of the 10th century, he says, refers again to the same Quranic verse to develop his argument that the government of two will be neither, the government of two wills, will be neither harmonious nor consistently effective, but impotence will inevitably attach to one or both of them. And so this, again, many, Avicenna or Ibn Sina, 11th century Muslim philosopher, uses the same kind of argument. And it's a very legitimate argument that there cannot be more than one absolute will. Otherwise, there would be either conflict or one will submit to another will, and thus there's only one absolute will finally. There cannot be more than one. So that's Quranic objections about the doctrine of the Trinity. I am first going to, because of the time for our session, I was planning to go through all the list of objections and then make the responses to all the objections. But I think it's best then if I right now spend the remaining few minutes we have in this session to talk about how do we make a Christian response. How do we make a Christian response to the Islamic challenge? Basically, as I've been saying several times, that on this issue, on the Quranic objection against the Trinity, we have to say that, first of all, the Quran doesn't understand the proper Christian formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity. And again, I just want to go back to that verse that is a key verse, Surah 5, verse 76. They do blaspheme who say God is one of three in a Trinity. Regardless of whether the Quran meant Father, Mary, or Jesus or not, we do not believe that God is one of three in a Trinity. We do not believe the Trinity has parts and the Father or God is 1/3, Jesus is 1/3, and another person is 1/3. We do not believe that there are three absolutes. There is one absolute. The Christian in church history, in Christian theology, Athanasian Creed, for example, a very famous creed. We do not believe that there are three omnipotents. There is one omnipotent God. We do not believe there are three omniscient gods. There is one omniscient God, one omnipresent God, one God with an absolute will. We will talk about the Trinity and its ramifications later with the three persons in God. But the Christian church has never said that there can be a possibility that the will of the Son can oppose the will of the Father and thus result in chaos or confusion or conflict. That there is one will in God and the Son is in perfect conformity to the will of the Father, as we read in the Scriptures. And so there is no internal tension, there is no internal fight, there is no competition in the Christian view of the Trinity, because we believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the divine Trinity. So the idea that the Christians believe there is more than one absolute will, or God is 1/3 of Godhead, is simply not the case. And in fact, one of the problems with the Quranic view, Quranic formulation of the Trinity, is the very Arabic word. The very Arabic word. Now, in the Yusuf Ali English translation, it says Trinity. But in the very, unfortunately, the very structure of the Arabic language, when, for example, in Surah 5, verse 76, it uses the word sales or thaleth, and or sometimes in Iranian or Arabic Christians use the word tathlith. But the very structure of Arabic language of the Quran, it's actually the word thalith or sales is to make something three. To make something three, or to call something three. And so really, many people have argued, especially Christians in Islamic contexts, that the word tathlith or thalith in the Quran does not even do justice, and it's not equal to the English word Trinity. Because the word Trinity, even in the English language, for example, that I'm speaking, it within the very word, which of course this word reflects Christian theology, is the idea of the triunity of God. The triunity of God. But in Arabic, the very word itself implies the three separate gods, basically. And so another struggle that we have in trying to engage in dialogue with Islam is to say that we are not talking about three gods. We are not talking about Father, Mary, or Jesus. We are not talking about three wills or two wills in conflict or confusion with each other. We believe that there is one God and one God only who has revealed himself to us as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We will go into all of that a lot more later on, what that means. But just to respond to the Islamic challenge, to the Quranic challenges and objections, that the Christian doctrine is not against the majesty and the sovereignty of God. In fact, we believe as Christians that the love of God and the incarnation is much more reflective of the majesty of God, of the goodness of God, of the love of God for his people. But my basic point on this issue is that the Quran, again, seems to misunderstand the Christian view. The Quran doesn't formulate or articulate the Christian view the way we do it ourselves. And I believe that in this day and age, it's very important for us to try to understand each other accurately if we want to engage each other in dialogue. In fact, I have a reference here to Shabir Akhtar. Shabir Akhtar is a Muslim graduate from Cambridge University, and one of the finest, I think, Muslim authors in trying to engage with Christians. He's also very critical of the Christian faith. And Shabir Akhtar, I think, gives us a very fine warning and encourages Muslims, I think, in a very good way. This is what Akhtar writes in one of his books. He says, most Muslims, including educated ones, know next to nothing about Christology. Now, of course, this is about Christology, not the Trinity, but I think it applies. Few Muslims can distinguish clearly between the view that a man claims to be divine, a blasphemy, and the entirely different view according to which God volunteers to become human, the Orthodox Christian conviction. And both of these views are routinely confused with the heretical doctrine that God adopted a son. Now, listen to this. This is written by a Muslim thinker. A Muslim cannot reasonably claim to be seriously engaged in dialogue with Christians unless he can possess a thorough knowledge of the Christian faith, and if at all possible, exercise imaginative sympathy with the ideals of that faith. What Shabir Akhtar is encouraging his Muslim readers is that you need to have an accurate understanding of Christian faith if you want to engage them seriously. And so our plea to our Muslim friends should be the same thing, that you should not just rely on your understanding of what it is that we believe. You should try to understand what it is we believe. Even if you disagree with it, at least know what it is that we say and what it is that we believe. So this is, our time has ended for this session. In the next session, we will pick up the other objections. The objections against the logical coherence of the Trinity, the titles of the Trinity, the introduction of composition and plurality into Godhead, and the historical objections. And then after addressing these objections, I want us to look at the doctrine of the Trinity from a fresh perspective, trying to shed some more light on how to engage Muslims on this conversation. So we will end our session here now.